It's also our pleasure today to introduce one of our speakers. Mohammed and I will be monitoring this session. If you have any questions, you could put it on the chat on Huba, right? Yes. And today we have Peleus Uhley, who has been working in security industry for 20 years. He has been a developer, a consultant, an incident responder, and a proactive security researcher. Peleus is currently a lead security strategist at Adobe and previously worked for Anomizer, Stake, and Semantic. He has spoken at events such as DEF CON, Black Hat, AppSec, Hatspot, CSEC West, and O'Reilly Security, and others. So welcome, Peleus. Thank you again for joining us, and we're really excited for your talk today.
Well, thank you for having me. As you heard, my name is Peleus Uhley, and I'm a lead security strategist and a principal scientist at Adobe. And today what I'm going to be talking about is the misinformation age and defending against deepfakes. And I'm honored to be back again at this conference. I'm a San Diego State University graduate, and the chief security officer at Adobe is also from Fullerton. So happy to be contributing back to the California State University system. So the reason why I picked this topic is that in my career, I like to go after challenges that can help people. And deepfakes are an interesting topic because they don't just target computers. It's not a computer against computer problem. It's a computer against human problem. And so there's a lot of opportunity and potential for using technology to help individuals and to help humans in society. And there's a lot of different ways that deepfakes can affect society. Not just the technology themselves, but also the threat of deepfakes is causing changes in people's behavior in society. The most obvious example is that society needs some way to determine truth in order to function. If a political leader makes a statement, then we need a way to know that that political leader actually made that statement, and so that we can make decisions and move forward in life. Obviously, we wouldn't want a deepfake to cause a war because somebody thinks that a political leader started making threats or something along those lines. But it's not always a simple case of, well, if the deepfake involves a political leader and I can identify it's a deepfake, well, then I shouldn't trust it. Because the world is complicated. And in India, there was a political leader that wanted to be able to reach a certain region of the country, but he didn't speak the local language for that region. And so he intentionally went out and bought and worked with a machine learning company to create a deepfake of him speaking their language for that region. That way he could deliver his message, even though he personally did not speak their language. So we're seeing deepfakes being used both as potential attacks, but also as ways of helping politicians reach more people. And then there's always the other cases as well. So for instance, a company called Sensitivity.ai did a report on the state of deepfakes. And they highlighted a bunch of different issues, but one of the issues that they highlighted was a technology called Deep Nude. And what it specialized in was taking photographs of clothed people and creating videos and photographs of them in the nude. And this technology ended up being used in ways they didn't intend, and they tried to take it offline once after they had published it. But the problem was it was already on BitTorrent and affecting people. And so Danielle Citron, who's a professor of law at Boston University, highlighted that deepfake technology is being weaponized against women by inserting their faces into porn. It's terrifying, embarrassing, demeaning, silencing. So it can create problems for people. And it creates problems for services. Reddit basically had to take their deepfake subreddit offline because of it. The same thing for Twitter and Discord. And this isn't just a problem for politicians and celebrities and people of note. just last month, there was a woman in Pennsylvania who was arrested on charges of targeting her daughter's rivals on a cheerleading squad. And so in order to go after her daughter's rivals, the charges allege that she created videos of those girls drinking, smoking, and being naked, and then sending them to the coach and other people in order to attack her daughter's rivals. So this isn't something that just affects people who are in the news. It can affect people in day-to-day life. But it also gets complicated because part of the reason why I say allegedly is now there's articles where they're saying, well, maybe the vaping ones are not deepfakes after all. Maybe maybe those were actually real. And it starts to get into what are we going to do in courts when people start using faked images as evidence in courts. And so the American Bar Association Journal did an article about how courts and lawyers are struggling with deepfakes. And they cite a case in the UK where there was a child custody hearing going on, and the woman wanted to win the child custody case. So she created what's known as a cheap fake of faked audio of the father to try to make him appear more malicious or in an attacking, basically in a malicious manner. And so then the question starts to become, how does this affect our courtrooms? Because in the past, if there was a video of you doing something, then that was pretty solid evidence, and there's a pretty good chance that you were going to jail if there was a video of it. But in a world where videos and images can be faked, then what does this mean for courts, and how are we going to verify that evidence in courts? And beyond that, it can just make it hard to enjoy the simple things in life. So for instance, we recently landed a new rover on Mars. Everybody was super excited about it. They wanted to see the new photos and videos from the rover to make sure the rover was okay and see the new area of the planet, and to see how good the cameras were on this new rover. Would we get higher definition images, etc. And someone knew that everybody was waiting for that content. So they went and they collected images from the previous Mars rover and put them together, and it got presented in a way that made people assume that this was content from the new rover. And so everybody got really excited. It got retweeted more than 41,000 times. It got 8,300 quote tweets. And basically 25.6 million people viewed the content going there to try to see new images from the new rover, when in fact, that was not the official content from NASA. It was pulled together from previous rovers. And so when you have these sort of things undermining even the simple things in life, it can wear on you, and it creates feelings of skepticism that cause you to disengage. So Adobe did a survey of about 1,200 people, 800 of whom were consumers, and 400 were creative professionals who create the content that we see online. And most of these stats are roughly the same, so I'm just going to say 2/3. But basically, about 2/3 of them said they frequently came across fake images online, that the images were concerning because they thought it made people believe misleading information, and that would eventually drive just distrust in the news and cause people to tune out of the news altogether. With one person saying, if we can no longer trust the images we see online or in the news, you just get completely skeptical of everything and people start checking out. And as a society, we need people to stay engaged, trying to make the world better as we move forward. And this isn't just in the US. We did a similar study in the UK where we researched 900 people, 600 consumers, 300 creative professionals. And the stats were almost the same, with 2/3 of Britons reporting that they frequently came across fake images online, 1 in 3 having seen somebody else like or share a fake image that they knew, that knowing the person who shared an image online didn't instill confidence, with only about 1/4 of them saying it helped them sort out whether or not to trust the image online. And almost the same stats for seeing fake images, causing them to believe people were getting misleading information. It was causing distrust in the news. People were no longer taking the news seriously, and that people would tune out of the news. So this isn't just a problem that's limited to the US. And then the final question that got brought up in both studies was, how would you know? Like how good do you think you are at being able to spot a fake image or being able to spot a fake video? And in the UK study, 1 in 2 people said they personally do a good job of working it out, but they didn't feel informed enough to spot images that were really good, right? Like if somebody with professional skill sets were to create it, they didn't know whether they had the tools or the knowledge necessary to spot one that was more advanced. So that was also a cause for concern for them. But there's no putting this technology back in the bottle either. This is something that's actively being used in a lot of different ways. For instance, Frito-Lay was doing a promotion with Lionel Messi, who, depending on what country you're from, is either a soccer or a football star. And the idea was that you could have Lionel Messi send a customized message to someone inviting them to a match. So you could go online, you could tell them who to send the message to, and they would get a personalized message from Lionel Messi inviting them to the game. But of course, Lionel Messi is a busy guy. He doesn't have time to record thousands of individual messages. So they used this type of technology to generate those videos, and they allowed them to do it in 1 of 10 languages. And it was a big promotion. Beyond that, you can even reanimate dead relatives if you want to. So there's a site called MyHeritage, where if you have a photo of your dear deceased grandmother, they can take that 2-dimensional photo and turn it into a video of her looking around and smiling and basically staring back at you from the grave. So this technology is out there. It's being used in a lot of different ways. And it's affecting the way that people interact with society. So if we're going to jump into this problem set, there's basically 3 terms that I want to be able to go over that can help with this discussion. One is the term shallow fake or cheap fake. And this is just an attempt to differentiate, your normal image that may just be photoshopped or is a low effort attempt on the attacker versus the ones that, somebody does a lot of machine learning on, and maybe they spend 2 months training a model to be able to do it. So to give an example of a cheap fake or a shallow fake, the most popular one was of Nancy Pelosi, where they tried to make her appear drunk at a news conference. And the video was real. She was at the news conference. She did say the words that appear in the video at the news conference. But all they did is slow down the frame rate of the video so that it made her appear like she was talking more slowly and more deliberately, and made her appear more drunk. And that video went viral online as Nancy Pelosi drunk. But there's lots of other examples. During 2020, one firm reported that they saw a 20 times increase in the number of cheap fakes that they saw online, with about 60% of them being political in nature. So for my purposes, I don't really care how much effort you put into trying to mislead somebody. For what I'm trying to do in terms of my work at Adobe with my peers is trying to protect against all of that. How much technical effort you put into misleading somebody isn't my primary concern. I'm trying to stop the problem altogether, regardless of where you want to draw the line between a cheap fake and a deep fake. You also hear the terms misinformation and disinformation, which sound very similar and are very similar, except for a 1-letter difference. And basically, disinformation is the thing that gets created, and then misinformation is when it's shared to somebody else to misinform them. And there's an entire lesson plan on PBS about these 2 terms and telling the difference between them. And the fact that PBS has to put lesson plans together to help schools with this sort of speaks to the level that this is starting to reach in society. And then lastly, there's the term the liar's dividend. And this one's a little complicated to explain because it comes from a paper from Georgia Tech, which is fairly lengthy, and they highlight several different points in the paper. So when you hear people use the term, you may hear them describe it differently depending on what portion of the paper they're trying to highlight. But basically, it's it's a way in which an environment that's unclear about what's real and fake can benefit those who either create and spread fakes or who create lies saying that something that actually is real is fake. So do I benefit from calling something fake news? And the answer that they came up with was yes, that there are basically two ways that people benefit from making allegations of fake news. And one is for the people who are fervent supporters of that politician or that leader, they're always looking to go out on Twitter and Reddit and YouTube comments and stuff to make comments in defense of that person. So you're giving them a war to go fight. And then also for people who are not fervent supporters, over time they will, you hear some of this term thrown around all the time, and you start to become cynical about it. And so what ends up happening is you may just give them the benefit of the doubt, because you always hear these stories and some of the time they're true, some of the times they're not. You're not deeply interested in knowing the answer either way, so you just give them the benefit of the doubt. And in that case, the leader would also win. And they also highlight like other attacks you could do. So let's say there's a video out there of me doing something malicious. Well, I could also go out and create, let's say, 19 images and videos of me doing that thing, but were created as deepfakes of me doing that thing. So now if you're a Reuters photographer who is trying to verify whether the story about me is true, if you pick a sample set of 5 out of the 20 and all 5 are deepfakes, then you may come to the conclusion that they're all deepfakes. And even if you get a sample set that includes the one that is true, you'll see 4 of them that are deepfakes, and then you might assume that the other one's also a deepfake. You just weren't able to prove it. So there's a lot of ways in which creating this environment of misinformation ultimately benefits the political leader. And it's a pretty good paper if you have time to read it. So then that brings us to how hard is it to actually create a deepfake? Well, you can go download the app from the App Store or Google Play is one way of doing it. This is not the only app out there that will allow you to do a face swap. There's also Wombo, Avatarify, and others. These will allow you to do basic face swaps. If you want to get a little bit more technical, there are open source projects such as Deepfakes Lab, which will allow you to do this at home using open source technology. And this one is a popular one that's used by the Deep Tom Cruise channel, if you know that one. It says it's like more than 95% of deepfake videos are created with it. I'm not sure if that statistic is true, but it is definitely popular and it's definitely being actively developed. So when they first started, they could only do images that were 64 by 64. And now they're up to doing videos which are 448 by 448. And I imagine that this will continue to increase as they put more research into it and more people are contributing. If you need to be able to do voice cloning and you want to do deepfakes of someone's voice, there are open source projects for that as well. There was one story in the news about a company where they were social engineered into doing a transfer of about $243,000 using a faked voice, or what they believe is a fake voice. They never caught the person, so they couldn't prove it, but they thought that somebody created a deep fake of an audio track to authorize that transaction. And these particular ones that I'm highlighting are not necessarily the best of the best. I just grabbed a couple screenshots to show that the technologies are out there, and there's plenty more if you go look. And then if you want to go watch a YouTube video on it, there's of course YouTube videos about how to make a deepfake in 10 minutes or less. If you watch the ones that are over an hour, they're much higher quality. They will give you tips and tricks to produce better deepfake videos. They'll tell you how to make it so that the machine learning algorithm has to do as little work as possible, and the less work that the machine learning algorithm has to do, the higher quality the deepfake will be. So I'm not necessarily plugging this one. It just had the catchy title, but there are definitely several YouTube videos out there about how to use different technologies. And this one uses Google Colab as a base for doing the analysis. And then if you want a more mathematical approach to ranking it, DARPA took a look at the adversarial landscape where they try to map resources and skill. And right now, the deepfakes and shallow fakes are sort of in the lower left in terms of the necessity for resources and skill. And there's a lot of potential for growth for those to advance up to your Hollywood Marvel Studios level CGI animation work that's out there. So how do you defend against these? So this is definitely a problem. How do you defend against them? And there's definitely a need to be able to defend against them. Groups like Facebook and Twitter, they all want to try to prevent their platforms from being used to spread misinformation and to be able to block these things. There's a California law that was passed to try to curb the use of disinformation in the 2020 election. But the question is how do you do that? When your Facebook and 3/4 of the planet is uploading images to you every day, you need some way of doing it at scale. You can't just have a human review every image and video that gets posted to Facebook. So Facebook decided to put their money where their mouth is, and they partnered with Microsoft and AWS for a deepfake detection challenge in 2019. And so they put together 10 million in grants, and they held a huge contest. If you're familiar with machine learning, Kaggle was involved, if you know that reference. And it was actually pretty successful. They had over 2,000 participants that submitted over 35,000 detection algorithms. I think they had to disqualify 1 or 2 people, but in the end, the winning algorithm had about a 65% accuracy rate for general content, which if you're Facebook, 65% is only slightly better than coin toss. So in and of itself, that wasn't great, but they started a process, and they got 2,000 people to actually start looking into this problem. And a lot of those people continue to work on the problem. One of the professors who was involved recently published a paper from State University in New York, Buffalo, where they were looking at trying to identify deepfake portraits. And they were able to get an algorithm that got up to about 95%, given a certain set of criteria. So while it's not universal, people are still working on these algorithms and trying to find different ways to improve them in different contexts. And the other thing that came out of this, if you've ever done machine learning research before, is how important it is to have a good data set. And so by having this contest, Facebook was hired thousands of actors to go and create video clips that they could use as part of their data set. And so the data set that they created for this has lived on, and it's available. And people who are continuing to research can continue to use that data set. And one of the groups that was looking to use that data set was Microsoft, who used the Microsoft Video Authenticator as a tool, or Microsoft produced the Microsoft Video Authenticator. And they did that using the data set from the Deepfake Detection Challenge, as well as one other detection challenge called face forensics. So having that data set available is also continuing to fuel the industry and allow people to continue their research. And that was not cheap to produce. In addition, I referenced DARPA earlier as mapping out this segment. And that's obviously because if deepfakes can be used for political purposes or potentially start a war, the Defense Research Agency of the US is going to be interested in how to protect the United States from these things. And they produced 2 projects. One is called Medifor, and that primarily looks at an image or video and tries to automatically detect manipulations and provide detailed information about how the manipulations were performed and give you a judgment of the overall integrity. So for that, you can feed in a video or an image, and it will try to do some forensics on it to try to determine whether or not it's a deep fake. But they also created a project called Semaphore, and that stands for semantic forensics. So in addition to looking at the individual image or video, what if you looked at the entire context of it? What was the news story it was presented in? What was the tweet that was presented in? And try to use not just the video, but the way in which the video was presented, who was presenting it, and other information to be able to verify whether the image is likely to be trustworthy or not. So they talk about multimodal assets, which are basically a media collection that can be treated as a single event or instance, such as a news story. And then looking at the image, video, audio, and text surrounding that news story in order to be able to do a holistic analysis of the information that's being presented. And the reason why they're doing that is they're looking at expected threats coming down the line. There's obviously your targeted personal attacks going after, for instance, a sitting president and trying to fake content from them. But the other thing that we see in the industry is there are lots of bot accounts on YouTube and Twitter and other platforms where they go in and they're just fake users who are creating comments in those fields to try to evangelize something or to make it appear like something has more support than it does, or make it appear that something's a bigger problem than it is. So then the question becomes, okay, if we have all these fake user accounts on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook posting comments, what if they could also post images and video? And what if we created a suite of faked images around a single thing and a suite of fake videos around a single event, and then try to create an event wholesale using completely fake people, images, and video? So that's a possibility. They were also looking at ransom fakes, which is basically identity attacks as a service. So, if there is somebody you wanted to go after, are organizations going to pop up that specialize in creating these high quality deepfakes and images to attack a given target? And so will you start to see crime groups starting to produce these things to either extort money out of somebody for ransom, or to just attack them in general? So having all these tools is really good. It's definitely positive research, but then the question becomes, what challenges come with these approaches? And there definitely are challenges. So you may be familiar with this, which got circulated on Twitter, where a machine learning algorithm couldn't differentiate between a device that had a picture of an apple and the word iPod on it and an actual apple with the word iPod on it. As sort of an example of how machine learning is still learning and growing as a field. And it is true. If you've ever worked in defense, you know that there's always an arm race in terms of doing detection. Is your network defensive technology really good at detecting an attack, or is it just really good at detecting metasploit? Because those aren't the same thing. And you need to make sure that your detection technology is generalized well enough that it can detect a wide range of attacks regardless of the tool. And some of these methods are not necessarily real time because it may have to be manually kicked off, and the delay between when something goes viral and gets identified may cause issues. Depending on how close it is to a critical event, and so like, did it happen right before election day? But these tools are definitely necessary. They're necessary for forensics in the cases that I referenced earlier with the American Bar Association, and courts needing to be able to go and identify evidence and make sure that the evidence is legitimate. And these are all solutions that can be implemented now. People are actively working on them, and they are providing value. So there's these I'm not saying that these tools don't have value. They're definitely one tool in their tool set. But they can't be the only tool in our tool set. And part of the reason why they can't be the only tool in our tool set is that there's an infinite number of ways to tell a lie, but there's only a finite number of ways to tell the truth. And so there are other ways of approaching this problem. For instance, let's say a New York Times infographic goes viral online, right? So we see this all the time. New York Times publishes something, and then you have conservatives who are saying, oh, you can't believe the New York Times, it's liberal propaganda. And you have the liberals saying, the New York Times is reliable journalism. You may not always agree with the conclusions that they come up with, but they're really good at sourcing facts. And the data is always true, regardless of whether you agree with the conclusion. It is reliable journalism. We can trust this New York Times infographic. But what if the infographic wasn't created by the New York Times? What if it was just something that somebody made at home and then slapped the New York Times logo on? Well, in that case, you still have everybody arguing. The conservatives are saying, hi, you fell for liberal propaganda because it reinforced your beliefs without checking it. And the liberals would be saying, this is designed to discredit the New York Times with people like you who don't check sources. And your whole basis for hating the New York Times is false because you're citing all these things that the New York Times never actually did. So, and that's one of the problems with misinformation is if you put it out there and everybody believes it, you get everybody arguing. If you put it out there and you get caught, everybody is still arguing. And as technologists, I can't help you decide whether or not to trust the New York Times. That's going to be based on your values and your analysis of what they produce and your own reasoning. But as a technologist, I can try to help with the second problem, which is trying to make sure that if you're going to have an argument over the New York Times, you're at least having an argument over something the New York Times actually did, that you're not arguing over something that never actually happened. And we can do that through what we refer to as provenance. And for this slide, there's one of the people working on this project, his name's Bruce McCormick, and he did a really good summary of this. And I'm sourcing him as a source of this slide because I pretty much stole it from his presentation. But he talks about the fact that in the past, news traveled from the source to the viewer pretty much directly. If you were watching Walter Cronkite, then the stream was basically directly from the studio to your TV set with very few intermediaries. If you were reading the newspaper, you just went down to the local bodega and you had the New York Times in your hand, and you were reading the newspaper directly yourself. But today, like our news gets proxied to us in a lot of different ways. Someone will write an article and the person will read it and they'll take a snippet out of that article and remove it from its original context and then put it on Twitter with their own context wrapped around it. And so, we get the view of the New York Times or some news source based on someone's repackaging of it and recontextualizing of it. And this separation from getting information from the original source is what allows people to inject misinformation and disinformation into our streams. So with provenance, you're basically putting a digital signature around the image or the video. So you can prove the identity of the publisher. You can ensure that it hasn't changed since the publisher put it out by verifying the hash and the signature. And you can secure the metadata included within the content. So you can add additional information into the image or video that someone can then go verify, like the GPS location of where it was taken and the timestamp where it was taken. So if you think back to the Mars example that I gave, if the misinformation that got spread from the old Mars rovers had a time, and then you can use it for observational purposes where you just verify that the image has been secured. You can do it for interrogation to see the details associated with the image, or eventually be able to use it in post-forensics processes. So there's two initiatives that got started to help try to provide provenance around content. One is the Content Authenticity Initiative, and that was started by Adobe, Twitter, and the New York Times. And its goal was to give content creators the ability to add provenance to the content that they created so that consumers down the line can evaluate whether what they're seeing is trustworthy. Is what I'm looking at from the news source that I think it's from, and whether their information are they providing me to help me believe their statement. And similarly, Microsoft started Project Origin with the BBC and CBC Radio Canada and the New York Times. And this focused mostly on video and news. And Microsoft created what they call AMP services, which is authentication of media via provenance, which included services like a manifest database and a public ledger service to record all of this provenance information that they were getting from the content that's being created. And this was launched by Microsoft in 2020, along with their video authenticator. And if this sounds like these two projects are very similar, they are. And the both teams recognize this. and they came together to form the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. So this is an open source project to create specifications and standards for going about adding provenance. It's being done with the help of the Linux Foundation in a joint development foundation project structure. It's an open source project. It's got overarching goals for privacy and extensibility and preventing misuse. And we're not creating any new image formats or video formats to be able to do this. We are just trying to make this available in the existing media formats that we already consume on our laptops and devices. And this is not tied to any vendor. This is completely open source. So the goals of this project are basically go back to the example I gave with the New York Times infographic. The goal is to allow you to identify whether that infographic was actually published by the New York Times. So are you talking about something that is actually real and that you can verify came from the source that you think it is? The goal is not to tell you whether or not to believe the source. This will be available as an open source project. Tabloids can use it, traditional news sources can use it, YouTube vloggers can use it. Anybody will be able to use this technology. It will still be your responsibility to decide whether or not you trust that person or that group based on your own values and your own reasoning. But we at least can help make sure that you're coming to that conclusion based off of content that the person actually created. So if we look at CAI at a high level, basically there's going to be a series of assertions about an image that you're going to want to add. You're going to say, I'm the person who created this. This is the GPS where I took the photo, so you know exactly where I took it. These are any manipulation techniques that I performed along the way. Maybe here's a thumbnail of the original image before I started tweaking it. Anything that you think can help the person better understand the context in which to understand the context of your image or video. And then all these assertions, along with the hash of the image itself, are going to be grouped together into a claim and have a digital signature that secures all those hashes. And then we can embed the claim directly into the XMP field of an image, which is basically a metadata field within the image. So right now the standards specify like how we're going to do this, what's the cryptography that's going to be used. We're pretty open to what type of assertions can be included. But to have a visual reference for it, this is basically the flow. You create the original asset, you decide what assertions you want to make about the image, about who created it, when, where, why. You can calculate the hashes of those assertions, put them into a JSON structure, create your digital signature, and then embed that back into the image. And this has already been used out in the wild. USC and Stanford University have a project called Starling Lab, which is around data integrity. And what they did is they sent a group of Reuters photographers out into the field to document the 78 consecutive days between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. So every day the photographers would go out, they would take photos, those photos would be secured using CAI. And we would have this provable historical moment documented via photography. And on day 64 is when the Capitol riot occurred. And so like having this data was important, one, for journalists. If you're going to put together, if you're a historian that's going to put together a book about this, you want to make sure as a historian you're using photos that were original and weren't altered, so that you're presenting history as it occurred. And then a lot of the people involved in the Capitol riots are being arrested based on the images and videos from that event. And so having this data available can help in the court cases to prove that, yes, this photo was in fact real of them being there. And if you go to this Starling website, then you can see the images, and there's an infographic. If you click on it, it will show you the who, what, when, where, and why of that image that the person included when they created the CAI embedding of it. But you may be asking yourself, there's a lot of challenges with this. And there are. One is a chicken and egg problem, right? Like how do you know how much editing happened to that image before the person decided to sign it and seal it up? And if you saw in the C2PA logo, we have groups like ARM and Intel as part of this project. And Qualcomm is another group that's been actively contributing as well. And Qualcomm created the first CAI compliant smartphone camera, where using their chipsets and their devices, the processor can talk to the wireless edge services to identify the device's identity. And then because it's happening at the chipset layer, it's responsible for secure image sensor data acquisition, talking directly to the camera and getting the bits before it gets signed. And then there's a mobile application from a company called TruePic, which can take the image from that processor and work with the processor to generate a CIA claim of that image, basically at the moment that it gets taken. So from the minute the image is created, it gets secured. And again, this goes back to being useful at trials. In the American Bar Association Journal, they highlighted the CSI effect, which happened when crime scene investigators TV shows became popular, and a bunch of people watched them on TV and they thought, oh, well, that's how crime scene investigation works in the real world. And so when they were jurors in a trial and they saw that crime scene investigation didn't necessarily happen the way that happened on TV, they would acquit, because they were like, no, they were supposed to do everything that I saw on TV. And when they didn't do that, there was distrust. And similarly, going back to the Adobe research, that sort of distrust can also lead into the courtroom, where how do I know this evidence is real, and how are we going to verify that it is true? There are also identity challenges with something like this. So the goal is to eventually support at-risk journalists who are maybe documenting atrocities that are going on in the world, and so they want to have CAI secured images to have that timestamp and GPS data associated with the image, and to be able to prove that the atrocity that they are documenting is real. But they may not want to have their personal name associated with it, because maybe the person committing the atrocity will also go after the journalist and harm the journalist. There's problems with name collisions. A lot of people have the same name. How do you know which person did it? The name itself is not a unique identifier. And as an open source standard, there's going to be a lot of different groups doing the signing. So we want something that can work across multiple platforms. And for that, we're looking at what are known as decentralized identities. And these are projects which are such as DID, WebID, OpenID, OrchidID. These are all identity platforms which allow you to have more control of your identity, independent of any big company. So right now, you may sign into a website, sign in with Google or sign in with Facebook. But the problem is, whenever you do that, Facebook or Google or whoever is aware that you're doing it, because all of your authentication is routing through them. And with a decentralized identifier, you can just identify directly with any entity without having to do sign in with Google or sign in with Facebook, allowing you to control your identity and not have that privacy concern of Google and Facebook and knowing everywhere that you sign in. And Microsoft's actually released an implementation of this called Project Ion, which runs on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. There are other companies out there that are doing it as well. Microsoft's one of the first large providers to do it. And then anytime you have a new technology, there's always the question about whether blockchains should be used. And blockchains are a possibility for this technology stack. The 78 Days Project and Project Origin both use blockchains. The distributed ledger service of AMP is a blockchain. But it's not the same as an NFT, which you may have noticed from the SNL skits. NFTs are more about who bought and sold an image. It doesn't necessarily give you provenance information about who created it and when and where and why. So it can work with NFTs, but it's not necessarily the same as an NFT. And then the last problem I'll highlight is problems with user communication. And I'm not calling Google out with this headline. Safari had already implemented what they're talking about in this headline. I'm more speaking to the more general concern that anytime you have to talk to end users, it's complicated. So for decades, we've been trying to express to people where they are on the internet and whether or not it's secure. And in the location bar, we used to have different colored locks, and then we changed the background color of the location bar. And then we got rid of both of those and just made everything gray unless there was a problem. But we decided to make the domain name bold to try to highlight the actual domain you were on. But even that is appearing to be confusing. So Google's looking at just showing the domain and not showing the full path in the address bar. It's a very complicated thing to communicate technical information to end users in a way that they'll understand. And what we're trying to communicate is more complicated than where you are on the internet. And then there's a question of where to represent it. So in the 78 Days project, you saw that the trusted UI from the image actually occurred in the rendering space, which would be potentially attacker controlled and is typically not a good place to display security information. And within Project Origin, since it's backed by Microsoft and Microsoft makes a browser, they were looking at putting the icon in the location bar where it's part of the trusted Chrome of the browser as opposed to rendered in space. So we're looking at things like that. Looking ahead, this is something that we're actively developing, and it's being done in parallel with a bunch of other projects that we will be onboarding as they become available. So the DIDs, the chipset improvements, having one Qualcomm chip that can support it is great, but we need to have more types of chipsets supporting this to be able to get them embedded in cameras. So we're going to continue developing this, and we'll onboard those things as they become available. But we will have a public beta of this later this year, where Photoshop will be able to add the information to these images. And this is all going to be developed as an open source project, similar to W3C standards. So the C2PA site will have the standards, and the standards will link to GitHub where they're being tracked over time. And we're going to have a lot of betas out before we finalize the standards, because that's the best way to make sure that the standard handles any implementation details. And then finally, how can you help? Obviously, following these groups and participating is a good thing, but, and using the public betas later this year, but there's going to be a lot of opportunities for research across all layers. So Qualcomm, is working at the hardware layer, so there'll be stuff for hardware people. Desktops and applications like browsers and Photoshop are being changed in order to be able to support this. So there's software aspects. These are all talking to blockchains and REST API services. So there'll be stuff for web people. Obviously, the machine learning still has a lot of growth potential. So there's opportunities for machine learning people to participate in this project. And if you want to know about deepfakes in general, the BBC Trusted News Initiative created a conference and resources called Beyond Fake News. And they have a whole bunch of content for how to identify deepfakes, what the news industries are doing to combat deepfakes, and some detailed technological implementation stuff that they're doing. So you can go find all this stuff online. The website This X Does Not Exist gives you a pretty good idea of how good deepfakes can get. The site's a little bit weird because you have to keep hitting refresh to see a new image. But they have sub-sites like This Cat Does Not Exist, This Human Does Not Exist, and you can see machine learning generated cats and people. And then a lot of people like the Deep Tom Cruise ones because there's a lot of effort that gets put into those, where they trained their machine learning model for about 2 months and used an actor who's already a professional Tom Cruise impersonator to be able to create the faked videos. And it just kind of shows the upper end of what can be produced. So with that, that's my information where you can find me online. And I don't know if I have time for questions because I know I ran a little bit long, but I'll go back to the resources.
So we just have 2 questions really quick. I think we have about 9 minutes.
Okay.
This is one question from the chat. What are the important aspects of the deepfake detection searches for? Is shading one of them? Yes.
In the slides, there's a link to a YouTube video about the Media Forensics DARPA project. And if you go and you watch that YouTube video, I think if you just go into YouTube and you Google Medi4 DARPA or Media Forensics DARPA, you'll probably find that video. And they look at a lot of aspects. They look at shading. So, if the machine learning algorithm tries to determine the time of day and do you have shadows coming from different angles. They take a look at semantic information. Is an image repeated several times within the overall image? So like is an object within the image repeated several times? Is there physics that's wrong in the image? So if you're dealing with things like water or smoke or mist, is that being done correctly? So they look at several things. This Buffalo, SUNY Buffalo work that was done to look at portraits was looking at the reflection within the pupils. And so was there consistent lighting and reflection within the pupils to be able to see if there are any discrepancies there? Because sometimes when the machine learning algorithm is trying to fake eyes, it will pixelate things in the pupil that other machine learning algorithms can detect.
Thank you. We also have another question. The next one is, when deepfakes are created, is it not possible to create a hidden watermark only detectable by another program? Although some people could find a way to disable it anyway. This was from
So for a watermark, since the default for images and video is not to have the watermark, it's the absence of the watermark would not necessarily prove that it's an original video. And there's lots of tools out there. So even if we added it to Photoshop, you could use Microsoft Paint or Linux GIMP or some other image editing software that doesn't support adding the watermark. So that has limited capabilities for being able to be useful forensics, because the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Right? Does that work in this scenario? But anyway, yeah, it would be very hard because somebody could remove it. And even with what we're doing with CAI, you could remove the CIA claim from the image, and that is possible for somebody to try to remove it. But the goal is that if the New York Times and Fox News and CNN regularly start adding these sort of things, then the default assumption will change about whether or not that should be there.
Thank you. Thank you for answering those questions.
Sure.
So we're heading towards the end of this session. The next one will be starting in about 5 minutes. And this will be, what is DFIR?
So, excuse me.
Yeah,
So if you are attending that session, you can stay in this Zoom link because it's going to be the same one. Yeah, so we have Abigail Duras and Ramon Guerrero in this next session. What is DFIR? So if you are attending that, please stick around, and we'll hope you'll enjoy it.
Yes, yeah. Thank you again.
I'll be on the Uhley app if people have questions as well. So feel free to reach out to me that way as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Ramon.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Right. Bye.
Mohammed, if you can stop recording, please.